Welcome again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Donofrio. I am the Managing Director of Ecosystem Marketplace, which is a program of Forest Trends, a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. We're thrilled to have you all joining us here today, as well as the speakers who we'll introduce in just a moment, to the online EM Insights briefing to launch this latest report around corporate strategies around climate change and the role that carbon credits play in the comprehensive approach around tackling climate change and investing in climate action. The report is titled All In on Climate, and it is the third in a report series that we initially launched in 2015. We had over 2,000 people register for today's session. Many more have requested copies of the report who were not able to attend. Both the recording and the report will be made available online, free to access for all to consume after today's session. The report is already live, and we have QR code and links that we'll be providing throughout the session today. A few thanks before we fully get started. Thanks to our sponsors, Conservation International, High Tide Foundation, Skoll Foundation, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, and the We Need Business Coalition. We also had around 25 individual market experts who provided market expertise and guidance as we prepared the analysis and finalized the report. But also I am just the representative of a very important and valuable team here at Ecosystem Marketplace and Forest Trends. While I led the production of this report and I had a very important internal team within Ecosystem Marketplace, including my co-author, Alex Procton, researchers Ciro Calderon and Laura Weatherver, as well as our editor, Jen Bennett. And we added a few people behind the scenes, including Charlotte Barber, Kate Brandall Ellis, Cheyenne Coxon, and Brina Manolis. And of course, thank you to Michael Jenkins, who's our founding president and CEO, for his leadership. So with that, I'd like to just provide a couple of opening slides here to set some context. And I've already talked about who we are, but I think what's important to communicate is that we are a not-for-profit organization. We do not have a market interest or a stake. Despite the name, we do not operate a marketplace, but instead what we do is serve as an independent and objective voice to communicate with data the realities and truths in the voluntary and in other environmental markets. Particularly with focus on voluntary carbon markets, what is part of our core activities is to facilitate market transparency through trade disclosure from a global network of over 270 market participants who are on the sell side. So product developers, investors, and intermediaries. They represent 40 countries, or just over 40 countries in terms of headquarter location. But the projects, the data that of the transactions that they report to us are from around 100 different countries. So while we're based in largely North America, we do operate as a global platform to provide trade disclosure through the market. This report that we're talking about today hits a bit of a different part of our work, which is the other end of the market. And increasingly, we have been making efforts on our side to increase the transparency, the information availability around what corporates are doing with the goal of tackling climate change, but where the placement of carbon credits sits, whether it's philanthropic, it's strategic, and how it is being leveraged as one of the climate solutions. And as we've done in the past, from 2015 and 2016, we have revisited this data set that originates from CDP, which is a global information disclosure system facilitated for corporations around the world. In addition, we have consistently found, and what we'll talk about in this report, is that of the companies that are indicating through their disclosures that they're buying voluntary carbon credits, that they are achieving greater impact and greater results when it comes to core metrics. And we'll talk about that in a second on climate change. And as you can see, when we launched this report in 2016 with then ICROA, now part of AIDA, the results show that companies that are buying credits are ahead of the pack. When we have returned now in 2023, this is our first major update, looking at from CDP data that we had available at the time of writing the report, 2022 disclosure data, which largely covers 2021. We looked at these core metrics around climate transparency, climate awareness, corporate accountability of climate change, climate ambition, and climate action. And we'll talk through these in a moment, and we'll go into some detail here, but the report is really where the majority of the information will live. There's quite a lot of data in the report, and we very much look forward to the feedback as you go through it. So before I go into those findings, I'd like to introduce our speakers here today. We're very lucky to have such an incredible group. We actually had a last minute change. So Luke Pritchard is standing in for Jenny Allen of We Mean Business. After Luke speaks, we'll also have a scene setting set of commentary from Will Turner, Dr. Will Turner from Conservation International. After that point, I will then provide the findings from the report and introduce our additional speakers, Lexia Kelly and Mark Kenber. Again, thank you all for your time. Really grateful for everybody's attention, to this very important topic, and looking forward to hearing from you, throughout the session in the Q&A, which we will have time for at the end of the panel in order to address those questions. So Luke, over to you to give us your comments.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Great to be here, everyone. My name is Luke Pritchard. I lead the work on land and nature at the We Mean Business Coalition. Just want to start by thanking Stephen and the whole team at Ecosystem Marketplace for inviting us to join this webinar, for leading this research, for allowing us to partner with them. I think judging by the turnout today, there's a lot of interest, and this is really timely as the debate around carbon markets really accelerates. So kudos to the Ecosystem Marketplace team for getting this report launched. I'd also just like to send my apologies before I start from our CEO, Maria Mendelus. She's in Brussels right now speaking live, so unfortunately couldn't join us here, even though she really wanted to. And our managing director of Net Zero, Jenny Allen, was planning on speaking, but she unfortunately, like so many parents out there right now with their kids back in school, has a couple kids sick at home today. But I'm very happy to do a little scene setting here on behalf of We Mean Business, talk a little bit about what this report means to us in the broader context of corporate climate leadership, kind of give a one-word takeaway on where we think this report is landing and what the research means, and then talk a little bit about what we'd like to see more of moving forward. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the We Mean Business Coalition, we catalyze business and policy action to have global emissions by 2030 in line with the 1.5 degree pathway. And so we've worked with more than 14,000 companies to activate their climate and net zero journey. And we've really been at the forefront of defining corporate climate leadership and then getting companies to act on it. So a few initiatives that we've been involved in that you might be familiar with include the Science Based Targets Initiative, where we were really the founding funder for many years and still work very closely with our colleagues at SBTI and sit on the board there. We're also the host of the SME Climate Hub, which is kind of the on-ramp to the UN Race to Zero for small and medium enterprises, where they can come and set a credible commitment and then start taking action to reduce their emissions aligned with science. And for those of you that were at Climate Week, you might be aware that we recently launched a fossil fuel phase-out campaign called Fossil to Clean, which is a set of principles for companies to accelerate a well-managed and just transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, really recognizing that the climate crisis is primarily driven by fossil fuel consumption. And we not only need to bring more clean energy online, but we need companies to send a clear signal that they're ready to transition away from fossil fuels. So through initiatives like these and many others that We Mean Business has led on, we've learned a lot about what corporate climate leadership looks like, what that journey looks like, and how you can really identify and characterize the companies that are taking a climate leadership role. And I think we can really boil it down to kind of three unnegotiable aspects that companies need to be leaders, and that's ambition, action, and accountability. So when we're talking about ambition, we need all companies to do a greenhouse gas inventory, kind of as the basic first step, include scope 3, so your entire value chain needs to be assessed. Then you need to set a science-based target that sets your commitment for reducing those emissions aligned with what the science demands. You need to start to lay out a climate transition plan that really talks through the steps that you need to take to reduce those emissions. The next one is action. So you obviously have to start investing in those technologies and in those transitions that are required to reduce your emissions. You need to start engaging with your suppliers. We recently launched an initiative called Supplier Cascade, which helps companies engage with their suppliers to also have them set science-based targets. So action is obviously the key of where we need to get every company today. And then the final one is around accountability. So companies need to report annually and disclose their progress. We can't wait till 2030 and certainly can't wait till 2050 to understand how companies are progressing on their journey. So when it comes to carbon markets, the narrative that we've seen emerge recently is that carbon credits aren't associated with climate leadership, suggesting that companies that are buying carbon credits are failing somewhere along that climate journey. Either they're not being ambitious enough, they're not acting within their own supply chain, they're not engaging their suppliers, or maybe they're not being transparent about their disclosures. But the fact that you have carbon credits in your strategy must mean there's something going awry with your climate leadership. And certainly, I think this narrative became a concern for We Mean Business. I think we recognize that we won't reach our climate goals if we can't scale carbon markets. But we also see the risk. We recognize that if they aren't being used alongside these other components of climate leadership, that ambition, that action, and that accountability, that they could also put our climate goals further from reach. And as an organization, we can only really support and encourage carbon markets if we know that they're being used for integrity. But I think the other thing that we recognized with this narrative that emerged is that it wasn't really based on data or empirical insight. It was based on anecdotes and kind of a general wariness of carbon markets. And for us, it's important that we're really driven by the data, that we're really driven by the evidence, and not on anecdote or suspicion. And so that's why we wanted to see this report come out and to see this research, and to see, are companies really failing on ambition, action, and accountability if they're buying carbon credits, or are they doing okay there? And so Stephen will present the findings, but I think the one word that comes to mind for us is optimism. And not only are companies that are investing in carbon markets not failing, they're actually really exceeding. They're more ambitious. They're more likely to set science-based targets than companies that aren't buying carbon credits. They're more likely to include scope 3 in those targets. They're also taking greater action, not just through their purchase of carbon credits, but in the amount of money they're investing within their own supply chain and how they're engaging their suppliers. And they're also being more transparent and allowing themselves to be held to greater account. So across the board, all of the indicators that were looked at, the companies that were buying carbon credits were outperforming their peers. And so it's clear that the majority of companies out there are investing in carbon markets in a way that makes it a clear characteristic of climate leadership. Not greenwashing, not delaying climate action, but really showing that they understand the science. That value chain abatement alone won't keep 1.5 degrees in reach. They're listening to the scientists who are saying we need to go further and faster, and recognizing that we need every tool in the toolbox. And one important tool that can get funding towards some of our underfunded climate priorities, like the protection and restoration of nature, is carbon markets. I might just put one caveat in here that these results don't mean, and we're not trying to say that every company investing in carbon markets is credible. That wasn't the point of this report. This report was really looking at the corporate ecosystem as a whole, so not how any individual companies were doing. We do know there's still bad actors out there. Let's continue to hold them to account. Let's scrutinize their plans. But let's also take a moment to take a step back, breathe deep in this kind of highly charged debate around carbon markets, and really appreciate the fact that companies are using carbon markets to go above and beyond. They're doing it completely voluntarily, and they're doing it in a way that will help us keep our global climate ambitions closer to reality. In terms of moving forward, I think one thing we would like to see is more companies come on board and follow the leadership of those that are already investing in carbon markets, while also showing leadership on ambition, action, and accountability. So there's a lot of companies clearly that are demonstrating this can be done. We need more companies to do it now as well, and to jump into carbon markets. But I think as a community, we also need to do a better job of differentiating good from bad. And I think part of the reason this narrative has emerged is because we're not doing a good job of differentiating those that are using carbon markets for leadership versus those who are using it to delay action. And I think the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative is going to be a huge part of that. I know Mark is on the panel today, Mark Kember, the CEO of VCMI, and he'll provide some more updates there. But I think VCMI is really going to be important for us to help ensure that the narrative moving forward is driven by data and the reality of actions that companies are taking on the ground. So with that, again, I think that the takeaway word for me is optimism. We're really optimistic about the direction that companies are heading and how they're using carbon markets to accelerate action as part of a holistic climate strategy. So I'll pass it now to Will Turner from Conservation International, who will give us a really important perspective, being a scientist and somebody working at a globally leading conservation organization. So Will, I'll go ahead and pass it to you.
Hello, everybody. Did y'all know that our global temperature has been more than 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels for almost a third of days so far in 2023? I'm going to talk today about why what we're discussing today really matters. And I'm going to mention just a few things that we should be looking for in this report. So the big question to me that we have to ask on climate is, what does the global system look like that makes it so that our children and those they share this planet with don't inherit a wasteland? The good news is that we know what the solutions are. Any credible strategy for addressing climate change does three things. Foremost, it means decarbonizing energy and industry. It also means pursuing new carbon removal technology. And significantly, it means protecting and restoring nature around the world. We need to rapidly shift forests and the land sector to zero and to negative global emissions by 2030. And we won't hit our global climate goals without that. So that's the good news. We know what we have to do. The bad news is that these solutions exist, but they are dramatically under-resourced. Maybe most acutely with natural climate solutions, but really across the board. There seems to be an expectation that public funding and laws are a way to drive this, and those are absolutely important. But if our strategy for addressing climate change comes down to waiting for success in governments passing legislation and allocating budgets, we are sacrificing our planet's future. And that is why this report is so important. It deals with carbon credits. Carbon credits are potentially an incredibly powerful mechanism for increasing the mitigation we actually achieve. Now, we know that the potential of emissions transfers or credits to increase mitigation possible in the coming years is enormous. Here's why. We know that the distribution of mitigation potential around the world, from energy transition actions, from natural climate solutions, and so on, it varies widely. And the costs of those activities vary too. So what that means is if we have a system that allows and enables trading emissions credits, it can have a huge impact. So in the next 10 to 15 years, trading emissions credits could result in gigatons fewer global emissions, with trillions of dollars flowing primarily from developed to developing countries, and a much greener planet than if we don't have those credits, if we don't allow emissions transfers. That opportunity arises from that basic math of how mitigation potentials and their costs are distributed around the world. But there is an if here. If we are going to realize that opportunity, you'd need to see some things. Are credits being used as a means to genuinely increase ambition and mitigation actually achieved, and not simply being used to do the same mitigation for less money? This may be the most important proof point for credits. You would want to see that companies purchasing credits are doing so not instead of decarbonizing, but in addition to decarbonizing. So that's a big thing we're looking for in this report, and it's really encouraging the strength of that signal that we see in the results. Another thing that we should be looking for is continuity. In Ecosystem Marketplace's report in 2016, we saw that companies purchasing credits at that time were more likely to be taking additional climate mitigation actions. But you might say what's possible for a small number of groundbreaking companies as of 2016 may not necessarily be possible when the market grows much larger, you move to hundreds of companies and beyond. So what we should also be looking for in this report is a sign that what we saw before is sustained here years later with a larger market. As a scientist, I'm excited to see this report coming out, partly because I think we're seeing good news in that. We are seeing that more often than not, the purchase of carbon credits is an act of responsibility. It's associated with greater action. But I'm also excited because on an issue like carbon credits, where people are often driven and decisions are driven by dogma and by speculation, it's incredibly important that we use evidence and data to understand whether we're on the right path and to refine and speed our collective efforts on climate. So with that, I'm really excited to dig into the details of this report.
Thanks very much, Luke and Will. And for 2021, although one question might be, well, it's a couple of years ago, it was really an important year for the voluntary carbon market. The pace at which transactions occurred was unprecedented. The interesting data that we see from the transactions that are reported to us is actually that, not all of those sales were going to end users. And in fact, the majority of those sales in 2021, in terms of proportion, were going to intermediaries who may be, holding or selling onwards again to end users, which are other intermediaries. But that is a secondary market opportunity which is a signal of a strong and sort of healthy, market. In 2022, and this is something we'll be diving into more in more detail in an upcoming report very soon, the market values actually stayed pretty close to 2 billion, but volumes declined, and as volumes declined, so did a growing global focus around high integrity supply of credits emerge, and a natural filtering started to take place where buyers began to prefer and pay more for credits, which they would feel more confident may ultimately be able to be used for their climate claims or for other purposes. So this is important to note because in 2023, we've experienced a number of different, sequence of events, whether it's related to kind of an impending series, a set of publications around from the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, who we'll hear from in a moment, who began releasing their claims code back in June. We're also hearing from market participants a need for more opportunities within the Science-Based Targets Initiative for the use of carbon credits, particularly around being able to use carbon credits to achieve net zero goals, and a few other factors that are really driving decision-making on the demand side, who would be, the ultimate users of carbon credits. And as we start to evaluate the current market conditions even more, we'll get into this in more detail, as I said, very soon. But it's important to acknowledge that 2021 was a very important year, and so equally important for us to be analyzing this data. I won't go into all these details here. I want to get into the findings. We have a series of methodology statements in the report. Please take a look at it. But just very quickly, this is 2022 disclosure year data for largely calendar year 2021. And I guess just to start highlighting, some of these elements here. What I think is sort of really valuable to see is that there's a sort of a growing number of companies that are active in project-based voluntary carbon credits. And in the way that companies can disclose their information, which some of it's very prescriptive, other fields are narrative or can be filled in directly by the company. We can see from around 7,500 total companies that there's a portion of these companies, 736, who are identifying themselves as a voluntary carbon buyer. And so the analysis in this report is based on that 736 number. Really, that's us filtering out some of those buyers that don't have a zero. So really the number of self-proclaimed voluntary buyers is somewhere just over 760 companies. The semantics of this are not as important as just to be able to say that is the pool of companies that we are using to try to understand their climate ambition, their climate awareness, their governance and climate action metrics against the non-voluntary carbon buyers. And when we break down that group of companies, we can see segmentation, of course, where there are voluntary buyers in different sectors. But from the CDP disclosing base, the majority of those companies are in the manufacturing sector, whereas the services sector make up the largest share of voluntary carbon buyers. It's a pretty wide and generic term, but we do list out in the report the specific companies that are top 50 corporate buyers, both in terms of their purchasing of metric tons, but also in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And aside from buyers, both in terms of their purchasing of metric tons, but also in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And aside from a few of those notable buyers around in international aviation and energy, you'll see a lot of companies that are likely being public in other spaces as well about their carbon purchasing. What is important to point out here, though, is that the majority of the 121 or so million tons that those 736 companies that are voluntary buyers reported as purchases in 2021, 72% of that volume was reported by the top 25 voluntary carbon buyers. So that list is also available in the report, and you can see that in more detail. But to get into the core elements here, and what we really try to do with this is go through the journey of climate action, which really needs to start with having strong oversight around climate issues, that it's not just handled by a division within the company, but it's being managed by the highest level of authorities, the board, and that also that the emissions are being calculated and reported into their CDP disclosures. And very interestingly, about 97% of the voluntary carbon buyers have board level oversight of climate related activities. And we can draw these comparisons against the non-voluntary buyers, as you can see here on the screen. But in other words, what that means is that they're 1.2 times more likely to have board oversight than the non-voluntary buyers. And as we all have heard the adage over the years, what gets measured gets managed, and that's also really important to see that nearly all of the VCM voluntary carbon buyers are engaged in reporting on greenhouse gas emissions. And we'll go through the details of that in the next slide. But this basically is showing that the fundamentals of having strong oversight and reporting of emissions is commonplace amongst the voluntary buyers. Next, we wanted to understand, just where the scope of emissions are for voluntary buyers. And in the past, we've done this analysis, and very consistent results have come up. And what we see very clearly is that for the non-voluntary buyers, the heaviest, weighting of emissions in terms of scope tend to be in scopes 1 and scope 2. And where for voluntary buyers, the largest proportion of their emissions are coming from scope 3 emissions. And so that is going to be coming out in another slide down the line, but it leads us to understanding, just just what part of an emissions profile does a company have available to invest in emission reduction activities that could be within the value chain, such as scope 1 and 2 emissions. And that could be anything from changing the building fabric of the operations to increasing transportation efficiency, as well as changing fuel sources and fuel types, but all the way to other very high intense investments in terms of CapEx and potentially longer term payback periods type of investments. Whereas scope 3 emissions are in the value chain and many times harder to make those direct investments in. And so that's where we see the balance of emissions and hard to abate or an unavoidable emissions being an opportunity area for the voluntary carbon markets. I guess further on this is that we looked at the different types of targets. So if we know that the emissions are being reported, then we need to have a pathway and a clear pathway which needs to be set to addressing those emissions by first setting the target. The target serves as a public barometer and beacon, but it also serves an internal purpose for corralling the entire organization around a common goal. So basically on the top surface level is whether or not companies have absolute or intensity targets, both of which are valid for science-based targets as well as for the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. But what's very important to see is that for voluntary buyers, their targets were 3 times more likely to include scope 3 emissions or to aim for net zero emissions. And that goes back to the reality that the majority of those emissions for voluntary buyers are in their scope 3. So it's important to see this alignment between where their scopes of emissions are and where their targets are. But also what's really important to understand is how much is science driving that climate ambition. And for us, we could do the comparisons to show that the voluntary buyers are 2.1 times more likely just to set a science-based target than the non-voluntary buyers. But to have it actually approved is where we see the higher number of 3.4 times more likely to have their target approved by SBTi. So again, knowing that the majority of emissions are in the scope 3, this is another signal that they have a comprehensive strategy in place where they're not just buying carbon credits, but that they're to clear a gap or to address emissions that they could be dealing with otherwise in their direct operations, but that there is a link back to these scope 3 emissions. And just a couple more slides here, but while we look at the investments across the board into emission reduction activities that I mentioned before, just about 17% of all companies that disclose investments into emission reduction activities are voluntary buyers. They accounted for 40% of the total investment. So 17% of all companies are voluntary buyers that are investing in emission reduction activities, but in terms of the total investment amount, they represent 40% of that investment. So said another way, that they are about 4 times, there are about 4 times as many non-buyers of companies as voluntary buyers, but those non-buyers made up only about 1.55 times as much investment into the voluntary than the voluntary buyers did. So I know these are a lot of stats, but it is important that we look at it in this context to see just how much activity the voluntary buyers are doing, not just always in comparison to others, but in general in terms of the whole. And then this is the second to last slide here. Again, a lot more detail is available in the report itself. But when looking at the table on the right, and this is more data than we'll talk through on this session here today, that first line refers back to the comments I made a moment ago in terms of percentages of market share that the voluntary buyers make up in terms of emission reduction activities. That second line, where we say a typical voluntary buyer, we're referring to the median voluntary buyer. And that is really important to see, that about the typical voluntary buyer is investing about 1.34 million into emission reduction activities, whereas the non-voluntary buyer is investing in just under $500,000. And so these averages are important to see, and you can see the prices of their investments, so the cost of the investment into those emission reduction activities as well. So there's a lot more data to unpack when you look at this in the data set and in the report. And then finally, where it starts to get even more interesting is when we can start to balance or compare that investment into emission reduction activities and look at the total volume that's being reported by the voluntary buyers of their purchases. But going a step further than that is, of their greenhouse gas emissions that they reported, and acknowledging that the emission reduction activities equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions have been already removed from those greenhouse gas emission totals for scopes 1 and 2, that the typical voluntary carbon buyer purchased carbon credits for just about 2% of their disclosed emissions, so just over 2%. And this is the typical buyer. But when we look at it in terms of absolute numbers, that number actually becomes even smaller. But so this is helpful to see the context that the emission reduction activities really are holding a very important role to driving decarbonization, reducing emissions at the operation level, whether it's direct from scope 1, indirect by purchasing RECs, renewable energy, but that these are happening together. And in fact, there's more investing going on into emission reduction activities from these voluntary buyers than the carbon credits that they're purchasing. So this is a lot to unpack. We want to bring it back to some of our speakers here to give some thoughts and hopefully have some time here at the end for Q&A. The report is available for download. I think the team is putting it into the chat as well, with the QR code here if that's easier for you to do. But with this, I'll hand it over to Alexia to talk through her perspectives on this report and everything I managed to get through today. Thank you so much. And over to you, Alexia.
Thanks so much, and good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. I'm Alexia Kelly, the Managing Director of the Carbon Policy and Markets Initiative at the High Tide Foundation, and it's a pleasure to be here today to help launch this incredibly important report. I think this question is one that's plagued our space for a long time, and increasingly raised very important question of, are companies doing enough? What are they spending their resources on? And what are the trade-offs between thinking about internal decarbonization strategies versus investment in external decarbonization more broadly? And it was very relieving to us, and we're very pleased to see that this data really tells a story of ambition. It tells the story of companies voluntarily going well beyond business as usual and doing the hard work of investing in their internal reductions, as well as investing even more into carbon credits. So as you've heard today, these voluntary carbon buyers are 3.4 times more likely to have an approved science-based target than companies that don't engage in carbon markets at all, and are 3 times more likely to include scope 3 emissions in those targets. And that's significant because scope 3 emissions constitute the preponderance of emissions for many, many companies that are in the climate leadership space. These same companies are decarbonizing at nearly 2 times the rate that non-buyers are. And in a world where every nth of a degree matters, the ability to pull forward and increase in scale emission reduction action is incredibly, incredibly important. But it also indicated that we are far from mobilizing the corporate action at scale that's required to even begin to make a dent in the climate crisis. So what this data shows is that of the companies disclosing to CDP, less than 10% of them have participated or purchased carbon credits on the voluntary market at all. And of that 10%, they're addressing less than 2% of their total reported emissions, which means that we are still in a tiny minority of companies that are actually taking this extra step to invest in carbon credits broadly. And that makes sense. Purchasing offsets is still very, very much outside of the norms of business as usual practice, as is putting in place and executing against a science-based target. When I was working to implement a science-based target in my previous role as a sustainability executive at a Fortune 500 company, I was really struck at how hard and slow even seemingly simple things like rolling out money-saving efforts such as energy efficiency or more efficient vehicles were. It required enormous amounts of engagement, social capital, political capital, in addition to financial capital, to really start making the fundamental changes to business operations that are required to decarbonize a company from the inside out. It is necessary work, but it's really, really hard, and it's going to take a very long time. So we're kidding ourselves if we think we can wave a magic wand and eliminate fossil fuels from business operations tomorrow. We can't. Unfortunately, they still touch every single aspect of doing business in the real economy and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. And the fact of the matter is we need companies to do much, much more than they're doing today. And those that are investing in internal decarbonization and carbon credits are in fact the leaders. We're very excited to be joined here by Mark Kenber from VCMI. High Tide Foundation is very deeply involved in the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, as are many, many folks on the line today, I'm sure. And what we're working to do is to build a new market architecture across those efforts for the voluntary carbon market in order to ensure that only the highest quality credits are used as part of companies' decarbonization strategies. So the next iteration of the carbon market can and will support companies in mobilizing significant additional resources to address the climate emergency. But we need to recognize and reward action and ambition, give credit where credit is due, and end the circular firing squad, because the climate crisis can't wait. We hope that this report helps us cut through the noise and focus on what's truly important, which is recognizing and rewarding climate action and ambition by companies that they're undertaking voluntarily today. Thanks for offering us the opportunity to participate in this exciting research and launch, and we hope that more data-driven information becomes available to help us chart this critical set of next steps forward. Back to you, Stefan.
Thanks, Alexia. And now just very quickly to Mark here.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you to you and Ecosystem Marketplace for this very important and very timely report. I mean, I think other speakers have said before how some of the myths around voluntary carbon markets and carbon markets investments, particularly, Will said that it's often been seen as a substitute for real action. But as Alexia has just said, real leadership is about doing both. And so we've discovered from today, and I won't repeat the numbers again, but very importantly, companies that use carbon credits are decarbonizing more quickly and have more ambitious and realistic decarbonization pipelines than those do not. That is a really, really important message, because for many years, people have said that, in the context of greenwashing, that this is a way of getting out of your responsibilities, or it's delaying policy, or it's delaying implementation of new technologies. And we're seeing that that's clearly not the case. In some companies, it's going above and beyond their science-based or science-aligned targets. For those, particularly in hard-to-abate sectors that just cannot yet meet their targets because technologies are not available, this is allowing them to bridge the gap. And if they didn't bridge the gap, the world, as others have already said, would be worse off. We wouldn't be reducing or removing emissions that we could do. The report, this bit of independent analysis, shows that most buyers are using carbon credits judiciously and part of a transparent, ambitious and integrated carbon strategy. And that is absolutely essential. I can't repeat that enough, despite the fact that others have. This is not carbon markets as a sideshow. This is carbon markets as an integrated approach to dealing with the climate crisis. But because of the pushback, because of the fears, because of the accusations, many corporate leaders have become reluctant to talk their walk about carbon market strategies, for fear of being typecast as greenwashers, for being accused of all those things that I've just mentioned. And so this report is really important to dispel that mistrust, that if you are a corporate who wants to show ambition and wants to show leadership, and most importantly, believes that we need to address this climate crisis urgently, not only should you be decarbonizing internally, working along your supply chain, but also investing in additional actions. And the voluntary carbon market provides perhaps the most mature opportunity to do that. So we know that allowing or encouraging use of carbon credits will lead to more companies taking more action quicker and generate more finance that can be directed to emission reduction removal opportunities that are currently available. And for that finance to flow, and Alexis mentioned the work of the ICVCM and VCMI, we need to firmly root end-to-end integrity in the VCM system. And it's no surprise, no coincidence that the ICVCM and VCMI both have integrity in their names, because we believe that integrity builds trust and trust builds scale. And this report and the work that behind it is part and a really important part of building that trust. But this trust also requires a handshake between high integrity buyers and high integrity sellers of carbon credits. So a connection where responsibility, accountancy, and transparency are forged, and that gives everybody, but particularly the companies, confidence to operate and grow their involvement. So we need all those elements. ICVCM and VCMI are providing a big part of it, but it needs others in the standard setting, disclosure, reporting space to come in too, so that there's a clear end-to-end framework that companies can follow and know that by following it, they're not going to be immune to all accusations, but their reputations will be ensured, and they can do so with confidence. And that's one of the reasons why the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, my organization VCMI, exists, is to provide guidance for companies on how and when they can credibly make use of voluntary use of carbon credits as part of their broader decarbonization strategies, and importantly, what they can say about it, the claims that they can make. And we've seen emerging regulation around claims, and VCMI is designed to provide an internationally applicable framework that companies can use so that they can have the confidence to engage. Because if, and others have said this already, but it's worth emphasizing, if we don't have companies investing through voluntary carbon markets, we are at risk of being left with a high volume of stranded opportunities to reduce emissions and or remove emissions that just will not happen. And these are opportunities that are available now at a reasonable cost using existing technologies. They just need the finance. And at the moment, as Will said very early on, if our hope is to sit back and hope that our governments take action, provide regulation and provide additional finance, many of those opportunities will disappear. That forest that we want to protect, if we say, just hang on 10 years till we get a more sympathetic government, that forest would have gone. The opportunity to invest and finance off-grid energy in rural areas, if we wait 10 years, people will have bought diesel gensets. Who are we to say, don't have electricity while we get our political acts together? The voluntary carbon markets, done well, provide an opportunity to ensure that those opportunities are not stranded and that we get closer to our goals for protecting our climate. So as a result, everyone involved in the climate change, in the fight against climate change, needs to coordinate and come together around this. Buyers, sellers, governments, communities, and NGOs. And what we've got today is some evidence that should give all those groups, including those of us on the call today, confidence to do so. It needs the support of government. The voluntary carbon markets need the sort of support of governments to encourage activity. And the report shows that some progress is being made in this area as well. So just to finalize, the VCMI will be publishing the final part of its claims code on November the 28th. We're delighted that this report has come out and that we have been part of it, because it gives more credibility to the idea of a voluntary carbon market. Neither I nor I believe anybody on this call believes that the voluntary carbon market is the solution to climate action. We've been negotiating around climate change for nearly 35 years. We should have economy-wide policies and regulations in every country in the world by now. But our collective failure to do that means that the voluntary carbon market is more rather than less important than ever. And so we all need to come together to continue to build the confidence so that companies themselves can have the confidence to invest, and be recognized when they do it with integrity, that they are leaders and not laggards, that they're driving climate action and helping us meet our common climate goals. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. The good news is a lot of questions that we saw in the chat, but also in the Q&A, have been addressed, in different ways. There are a few that I think would be good to kind of surface up. Mark, you actually just answered one of the questions, which is about kind of the final publication from VCMI and when that's expected. So I think there's plenty of details on that, unless there's anything further you'd like to say. But I think what we're also kind of seeing a lot of questions about is how influential and what are is SBTI, in this equation, for companies, and what are the other factors that are important for companies as they're deciding about carbon credit purchasing over the next, let's just say, 6 months, so that they either feel comfort in being able to participate as a buyer, or they are standing on the sidelines looking at it from the outside in, considering the research that we've presented here today. But what are those external factors that people should be aware of? And I maybe just put this out to anybody who would like to jump in first on this, and then have a couple of other questions, one for you, Dee, and Alexia, and then maybe also one more for you, Mark.
Well, shall I jump in? I mean, I think even in the 2 years since that boom year that you showed in one of your first slides, there have been huge developments in the voluntary carbon market. And Alexia mentioned the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, and obviously the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, which are creating rule books for the supply side and the demand side. We've seen lots of accusations, some true, some less true, over the course of the last year or two about both the supply and the demand side. But I'm confident, involved with both of those initiatives, and they've been time consuming. We would have all liked to get them out in a couple of weeks 2 years ago, but these have been really thought through so that we're going to have a high integrity supply and a high integrity demand. And as I said when I made my comments earlier, that's the only way this market is going to grow. It may seem at times that it's made life harder, but I don't believe that's the case. Once we get the core carbon principle units out in the marketplace, and companies recognize that following the VCMI guidance gives them claims that have value in the wider world, and that people say, yeah, these are companies that are leaders, then I think the market will grow. You mentioned SBTI. I mean, SBTI has done a remarkable job in just under 10 years of creating a framework for companies to set targets, particularly in those jurisdictions that don't have cap and trade or carbon taxes. So, to have nearly, I think, over 6,000 companies that in some way associated with SBTI is great. And that science-based target, science-based pathways is absolutely essential. I think one of the things that comes out today, and this has been out of your report today, and this has been a bone of contention for some time, is the idea that companies, if they use carbon credits, then they won't decarbonize, and that it's an either or. And this report, and what we've heard from the other speakers, shows that is just not the case. Companies who are decarbonizing, companies who are using carbon credits, are decarbonizing more quickly, are more ambitious, and are investing more. And so I think while we still need those target frameworks, we need to be more open, more flexible about what we want companies to do, how they get there, and how they go beyond the targets. And as Will said, this is not about substituting one for the other. This is in addition to, and the report says very clearly that companies using carbon credits in addition to, not as a substitute for their own decarbonisation.
Thanks for that, Mark. And I'd like to maybe offer an opportunity for Dee to jump in here, and who's a well-respected individual in this space and has been for a long time, to maybe feed in on any thoughts you might have coming from your perspective around where companies are, what will it take to unlock opportunities for the next tier of companies to engage, and potentially also those companies who may not be as far along on the climate action continuum as some of these others to have a chance to participate while they get all of their other ducks in a row. I mean, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to share here, dear, but we'd love to hear from you.
All I would say is that, with the initiatives of DCMI and ICVCM, I think it's almost end-to-end transparency and building trust and reliability in the market, so that hopefully it's going to encourage more companies to wade in if they're already in at a higher level, and if not already in, to pay attention that the market is solid, trustworthy, and as Mark pointed out, a really efficient way to direct money to climate action. So I was just amazed at the results of this study that showed that only 2% of climate investment in, improving and in reducing emissions by companies is spent on carbon credits. To me, that says that the overwhelming efforts are on decarbonization, but that this is a needed tool. I just keep going back to the whole idea. We need everything. We need it yesterday. We need it today. And we just have such a limited time that I think we need to be all in on every possible solution. So thanks for giving me a chance to talk. And what a great job on this report. So thank you, Stephen.
Thanks for that, Dee. And looking at the questions, there are a lot about the methodology, the approach, which we could definitely address potentially in our follow-up here. We'd love to make sure everybody's very clear about what we did for this report. And so the report, as you see it, there is a large methodology section that goes into a lot of detail, explains which questions from the CDP disclosures we used. It also is important to clarify that this is the CDP disclosing company universe that we're evaluating from. We know, looking at registry data, and we know looking at our data, that there are other companies, of course, that are buying carbon credits and those that are in that CDP bubble. But what's unique about the CDP data and why we decided to use it for this is because it is a comprehensive corporate disclosure system. There is an explicit question on carbon credit purchasing. But our ultimate message is that transparency underpins market integrity as a fundamental. Good news is great, but so is bad news. We need to know when things are not going well, because that void of information leads stakeholders into taking their own inferences, believing what they want to believe, and taking charge of a narrative that may not exactly be factual, be accurate. So I think what is ultimately really important is that we convey that transparency, good or bad, progress or lack of progress, showing where we can compare and how we cannot compare companies that are buying credits versus those that are not. All of that is incredibly important for us having a thorough understanding of the health and state of the voluntary carbon market from end to end. So I know we're over time, and I'd like to respect our speakers' schedules and all of yours. I'll just kind of quickly get back to the slides here to close us out. We can address some of the questions that have come through in follow-up. So we as I mentioned before, we're an organization that works collaboratively with different partners and organizations. And for us, this report is unique in that we don't do it. We have not done it deliberately every year since 2016. But we have a number of supporters that work with us to support the work that we do on a daily basis. But we are very, very grateful for your attention, to us in this webinar. We're very grateful to our report sponsors and our collaborators who have given us this opportunity to bring this information, using our platform to help, clarify and communicate about what is going on the buy side of the corporate part of the climate voluntary carbon market. So with that, I'll thank you all again, thank our speakers, and wish you a great rest of your day and good rest of your week. Thank you so much.